Hello and welcome to Vermont Film Essentials. I'm Hayes, Lincoln L. Hayes.
And I'm just David Metzger. Today is a special episode because usually what happens is I shove all the movies that I love down this guy's throat. But this time he made a request and he wanted to do a James Bond film, and he wanted to do not only a James Bond film, but the very first James Bond film, Dr. No, and that's what we're doing this evening. And cheers.
Cheers with our water.
It's a good thing too, because when I was 19 and I went to Montreal for the first time and I could legally drink, I thought, wouldn't it be cool to get a martini like James Bond and realize that it tastes like pure gasoline?
Because it's just straight alcohol. So anytime somebody orders a martini straight up, that's just full of vodka or gin, guys. And it doesn't taste good. I remember my first martini was a Vesper Lynn at a cocktail bar in Manhattan, and it was awful. Because it was just gin, vermouth, Lillet Blanc, and a bunch of other stuff that tasted like gasoline.
You don't feel like James Bond drinking it.
Well, I mean, if you're hammered, then yeah, you'd feel like James Bond, because he's an alcoholic. We are talking about the first James Bond film, Dr. No, which came out in 1962, which is actually the sixth James Bond novel penned by Ian Fleming. And I know that because I read some stuff. For my birthday this year, I was gifted 3 James Bond novels: Casino Royale, Live and Let Die, and Moonraker. And I've read the first 2, and I have not yet read Moonraker. And I have to say, I mean, they were written in the 50s, but Ian Fleming is a big old racist. And he hates women, and he hates gays.
I mean, I haven't read any of his novels. I only know the last line of Casino Royale is "the bitch is dead."
Yeah.
So
he doesn't care much
bode well
for them. Live and Let Die, of the 2 that I read, was the most difficult to get through just because of the racial terminology that he used, let's say. But like I said, this is the 6th novel, and they decided to go with it as the first film because it's one of the more straightforward stories. It has one central location, Jamaica, and one big set piece, which is Dr. No's lair.
That's what surprised me about it, watching it, because I haven't,
these are all mine.
It's been a long time since I've dived into all of this.
Yeah.
But watching this for the first time, and there's so many of them that, like, other than I love Goldfinger, because that was the first one I saw, so I think that has something to do with it.
Of course.
And then GoldenEye hit at that right point in my
95
time where I was just like, I want to devour all James Bond,
and it was the rebirth of the franchise after a 6-year hiatus from Timothy Dalton.
But what surprised me about this first movie was just how simplistic the plot was, how easy to follow it was, and just not convoluted, not so many characters or so many villains. It was just,
Yep, and we don't even have Q yet.
Nope.
We have Major Boothroyd, who comes in to give him his Walther PPK, who is then replaced by Desmond Llewellyn in later films, and Q branch is expounded upon. But before we dive into our discussion of the film, we have a little bit of commentary from our friend Kyle Anderson. He and I used to do the WTF Are You Watching podcast, now the What the Hell Are You Watching podcast that I do with friend of the show, Tim Bridge. And in our early days, we did 2 episodes dedicated to the James Bond films. And he's written extensively about James Bond for Nerdist, so he is quite an authority in James Bond. So let's let him take it away with his little 2 cents about Dr. No.
To Americans, England had always been a place of stuffy, pompous, prissy people, a place for intellectuals and important works of art. Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, Jane Austen, Noel Coward, Laurence Olivier, David Lean, Winston Churchill, Queen Elizabeth, and so on. So how then did England become hip in the eyes of Americans and the world? Well, you can pretty much trace it to one moment, October 5th, 1962, when out of nowhere, England became the hub of cool for an entire decade. The Beatles released their first single, Love Me Do, and on that same day, Dr. No was released in cinemas, both creating phenomena the likes of which have never been matched in movies or music. The road to James Bond on film was a long one. Writer Ian Fleming, a spy during World War II who fancied himself a sophisticated playboy, began writing his suave and methodical super spy in 1953's Casino Royale. A year later, Fleming was paid all of $1,000, a little over $9,000 in today's money, so CBS could turn it into an episode of its climax mystery theater, with Barry Nelson playing American spy Jimmy Bond. After Fleming had written a total of 10 novels and many other false starts, producers Albert R. Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman set out to turn the sixth Bond novel, Dr. No, into a major motion picture. Sean Connery was a brash and swaggering Scotsman, and it was up to director Terrence Young, a director of a bunch of films you've never heard of, to craft him into the debonair James Bond. His clothes, hair, manner of speech, etiquette, way with the ladies, and deadly precision all had to be molded around the strapping actor. As evidence of his triumph, Young gave him one of the greatest introductory scenes in all of film. A high-class casino. Everyone in dazzling gowns or tailored dinner jackets. People sit around a table playing baccarat, a game I'll never understand. Our eye is drawn to the beautiful woman in the red dress in the middle of the frame. The camera pulls back to reveal her opponent's back. She asks to see his cards, and we cut to a shot of the table, his hands flipping over the cards. She's lost. Another hand is dealt, still only seeing the opponent's hands. The woman loses again. As his hands draw a cigarette from a shiny case, he says, "I admire your courage, miss." "Trench, Sylvia Trench," she responds. "I admire your luck, mister." The camera cuts and we get our first shot of Connery lighting the cigarette. Bond. James Bond. Who cares what happens in the rest of the movie? We had our iconic moment right there. The film introduced us to the beautiful Ursula Andress as the world's first Bond girl, Jack Lord as CIA man Felix Leiter, and Joseph Wiseman as the titular megalomaniac with metal hands, all of whom have their own place in action movie history. But over 55 years and 23 sequels later, it's Bond, James Bond, that remains the moment England became cool as shit. Special commendations need to be made for some of the personnel on this film. Terrence Young would direct the follow-up From Russia with Love and the fourth film in the series, Thunderball. Connery would make 5 more films in the official James Bond canon and another in the 80s for rival producer Kevin McClory. That movie straight up sucks. Cinematographer Ted Moore would photograph 6 of the next 8 Bond films, retiring from the series with 1974's The Man with the Golden Gun. Production designer Ken Adams' large, semi-futuristic sets would become a hallmark of the series for 6 further films. The colorful, shadowy pop art title sequence was done by Morris Binder, who'd returned to the series with 1965's Thunderball, and would perform the job on every Bond film going forward until A License to Kill in 1989. Editor Peter R. Hunt would edit the first 4 films in the series before graduating to the supervising editor and second unit director on You Only Live Twice, and finally getting the shot at directing the once reviled and now beloved On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Richard Maibaum would write or co-write a total of 13 of the first 16 Bond films, and he probably would have kept writing them, except he died in 1991. And finally, Monty Norman's Bond theme remains arguably the most iconic theme tune in film history. And now that my yapping is over, please enjoy Dr. No.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Kyle. Insightful, and thanks for swearing. First time you saw this movie, do you remember?
I can't. The only thing that I know is that I remember the first time, it was like the lead up to GoldenEye, because everyone was excited about GoldenEye coming out. It made a big thing.
Yep.
It was on all like the entertainment news discussion boards and all that stuff. So then it was just like, I want to know more about James Bond. And my mom loved James Bond, specifically loved Sean Connery.
Of course.
So that's where she started me. And I think like Goldfinger was the first one we watched. I loved the theme song.
Yep.
I loved all the cool gadgets. And you know, then I saw GoldenEye, loved that, and then just started kind of like sporadically watching one. So that happened at such an age that I can't even really recall what I saw, when I saw it. So I know I saw it in there because I remember the Jamaica sequence. I obviously remember Ursula.
How can you forget?
So it was somewhere like around age 12, 13.
Yeah. So I would have been 95. I would have been like 11 when that came out. And I didn't see it in the theaters because I didn't have access to it, but my best friend growing up had a Nintendo 64, and he got GoldenEye, which is still for my money, the best multiplayer game ever made, especially the best multiplayer shooting game ever. To this day, if somebody were to like, hey, I got a 64 in GoldenEye, I'd be like, cool, I'm going to hang out at your house for the rest of my life. And I remember seeing the movie and really enjoying it, and then kind of going back into the catalog after that as well. And for the longest time, these weren't readily available. Like the Bond resurgence really happened in the early 2000s, I feel, and maybe it was just my knowledge of it, but I feel like James Bond was always a thing since the 60s. And it was like, oh yeah, I've seen some of them, or oh, I saw, you know, a good number of them. And then you have your opinions on, do you like Sean Connery better? Do you like Roger Moore better? Are you super weird, and do you like the one that George Lazenby did? Or are you even lesser minority and you love the two that Timothy Dalton did?
Which, if you're Christopher Nolan, then you do love the George Lazenby one and think that it's the greatest Bond.
It is. I mean, George Lazenby's On Her Majesty's Secret Service is such an anomaly. There's a fantastic documentary in Hulu about it called Becoming Bond. And you kind of got to take it with a grain of salt because I kind of feel like George Lazenby is an unreliable narrator. Some of the stories he tells, you're like, I don't know if it happened like that. That's pretty fantastic. But the movie didn't do that well because it wasn't Sean Connery. It also didn't do that well because when it came time to promote the film and for the premiere, Lazenby shows up super hippied out with a beard, refuses to shave, and isn't the suave James Bond that the producers wanted him to be. And he basically got himself fired from the job. So he only has the one. And then there's, of course, the stupid line at the beginning where something happens to him and he looks directly into camera and goes, oh, that never happened to the other guy. And you're just like, oh, why did you even acknowledge that? But anyway, Dr. No, the first one. As we said before we started recording, I think I've only seen this twice.
Yeah.
I think I saw it once when Kyle and I first did our Bondversation on the podcast, and it is very simple. It's very straightforward. But the first I ever saw, I think, was Diamonds Are Forever on TBS's Dinner and a Movie. Remember that show?
Yes.
It was
Paul and
excellent.
Annabelle.
Yeah, it was great. And I taped it. I recorded it onto tape because I was like, oh, it's James Bond. I'm going to record this. And that is probably one of the weakest Bond films. It's Sean Connery's return. He does 6 films, leaves, Lazenby comes in, does On Her Majesty's Secret Service, then he does Diamonds Are Forever, and then he leaves again before doing, oh, now I can't remember.
Oh, it's You Only Live Twice.
No, Never Say Never?
Never Say Never.
The unofficial one, the non-Eon Productions one. And then there's a whole can of worms that we can get into regarding that. But from Diamonds Are Forever, I was like, okay, this is fun. And I knew about it from GoldenEye, and it was all around that time. But it wasn't until college that I really was able to find more of them on DVD and get into it. And then a few years ago, Kyle gifted me this box set because I'm pretty sure, since he does all his reviews and things, he's often given box sets to review and stuff. I think he got it on Blu-ray. So he's like, here, have all the DVDs. And I was like, awesome.
Thanks.
So I own all 24 James Bond films. I didn't bring the Kraggles because they don't look as pretty in their set. But this is great. And this is actually really smart because they don't do it in order. So if you're like, oh, I just want the Sean Connerys, there's
just buy
2
that.
in there, 2 in there, 2 in there. You know, it's all over the place. Like, I don't even think Dr. No was in the first box set. So you have to get the whole thing to get the whole collection, which is kind of a kick in the teeth because you're like, man, that's a lot of money to spend. But if you're a true fan, then it's not that big a deal.
It's funny how many resurgences it seems to have had throughout the years because, you know, the big thing is like, are you a Connery guy or are you a Moore guy?
There's that conversation of who's your Bond, just like with Doctor Who, who's your Doctor? And it's like, oh, well, you know, I like the 3rd Doctor, I like the 6th Doctor. It's crazy. And, you know, there's also strange theories of, is he a Time Lord? Is it supposed to be the same person? Is James Bond just a moniker? Is that actually his code name? And it's like, all right, everybody just calm down. It's just
That's crazy.
Watch and enjoy these spy movies. That's the point.
You know, I only remember, because obviously Timothy Dalton has 2.
Yep.
Right. So I only remember from The Living Daylights that it was on HBO, and I just remember, I think there's a chase across the ice.
Yeah.
And,
I think that's Living Daylights, yeah.
And that's the only thing. Like that's the only thing I remember. It was like, you know, my brother and I are like, oh my God, the Living Daylights is on. Do we miss that chase? Like that's the only thing we want to see. And then License to Kill is like
crazy.
What is this? This is like a dark, crazy.
License to Kill is like
it's violent.
Die Hard-ish.
Yeah.
Because it's around the same time, and it's Robert Davi, and it's. But yeah, that's when James Bond goes dark. And it's kind of panned for that reason. People are like, this isn't the same fun.
I only remember the scene where the guy gets into the machine and he blows up. And like me, like being a kid and being like, what the? Like scared the crap out of me.
And my takeaway from that movie is that he drives the big rig on the wheels. And is managed. They do that twice in the James Bond series where somebody drives a car on two wheels.
And that's it seems like with each one, like with GoldenEye, it became more Daredevil. Like I remember we saw GoldenEye, and my friend and I at the time, like we left the theater, we're driving home with his mother, and his mom was like, "How was it? How did he do?" And we're like, "Oh, it was awesome." And then my friend being like, "Yeah, but there's stuff that's like really ridiculous. Like there's a scene where like he jumps off of a thing and he's attached and he's on the plane and he jumps." And she's just like, "Yeah, he's James Bond. He does that crap."
She gets it.
And what's weird is like, especially watching this first one, it's like all the things are there.
Yeah.
There's the opening with the gun. There's the iconic music that is forever etched in James Bond legacy. There's the suaveness. There's the Bond, James Bond. There's the oh my God, I can't remember if he has the martini in this. The martini starts in this.
Yep.
So there's that. But there's not that many Daredevil theatrics to it.
Right. It starts out just I work for
I'm
British intelligence. I'm a spy, and I have these things to do. It's not until we get kind of into the Roger Moores that things just kind of go off the rails and are like, now we got watches with magnets in them so I can unzip ladies' dresses and grappling hooks and all this other stuff.
Which I wonder if that was a reaction to, like, I think Mission Impossible came out around the time that Roger Moore was starting his thing, and like that's what started the whole, like, we got to compete with this.
Yes, very much so. These films have always been somewhat of a response to the time. So like the 60s have a certain feel to them, and then the 70s have a different feel to them, and then like you get into some of the Roger Moores, especially like Live and Let Die, kind of feels like a blaxploitation film because that was going on right then, and that was the thing. And you can kind of follow the technological trends with James Bond films. So like we first see him really using a cell phone in Tomorrow Never Dies. About the time that cell phones are starting to become more prominent. So you have like your familiar Nokia brick, but then it flips open. Oh, that's new. And then he can control his car with it. And whoa, that's crazy. And now you can kind of do that. Like you can start your car from your phone now. Like things that happened in James Bond have become things that we have.
We can finally be James Bond.
Exactly.
For reals.
And it's pretty damn exciting for nerds like me. But Nocturno is, we have Bernard Lee as M, who will be M in my mind forever. I mean, Judi Dench does a fine job as M, but Bernard Lee is M. And like he got the part like almost without any contention. They're like, yeah, you're Bernard Lee. We have Moneypenny. She stays Moneypenny for several films. We develop their relationship of the will they, won't they flirtation all the time. He throws the hat for the first time. We like have all of these little moments. And then we're whisked away to, fantastic Jamaica, and there's all this crazy stuff going on, and people are out to get him, so we got a lot of fighting, and we got a lot of great suits. But no real gadgets in this one.
Right.
So it's still grounded and not too fantastical and believable. And then we have our villain with his mechanical hands, who is, trying to launch a rocket and all this stuff. And it's very simple, and, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And we have our bad guy lair, where everybody's in the weird plastic suits, which is then spoofed in Austin Powers beautifully. Where he can't sit up or stand right because he's wearing this stupid plastic suit. And then we're just off to the races from there. So I haven't read this novel, obviously. I'm not there yet. But I'm very interested to read the novel and then compare it to the film, because when Ian Fleming saw the film, he said that it was dreadful, simply dreadful.
Right.
To which I say, so is most of your writing, Mr. Fleming, because I don't like his books. It's so crazy that I can love the characters and like what's going on and just hate the way that he writes so much. It's so unnecessarily like flowery and overly descriptive, where you're like, you just spent 2 paragraphs describing a martini. Can we get to the point, please? It's a martini.
And it's, I don't know, it's funny to hear, because the whole franchise, through today's modern eyes, well, you can't help but, you know, there's a sexism throughout it.
Absolutely.
There's a chauvinism throughout it. There's like a way that you can look at this as just like the ultimate male fantasy.
To the point where in Goldeneye, Judi Dench comments on that.
Yeah.
She calls him a dinosaur from the Cold War. Which, yeah, it is. And that becomes kind of an issue with the later Bonds, is it's like, do we need James Bond anymore?
Right.
Thankfully, in the Craig era, they've been able to, you know, adjust it and make it work. But in some of the Brosnans, it's like, we don't need this anymore, guys. Hence its kind of dip in popularity and then resurgence.
And it's weird, like it's almost like with the Craig one, it's like you can't have it both ways, because with Casino Royale, like you feel like it's like, okay, we're taking James Bond into the post 9/11. Everything is super serious. This is realistic. This is the way Bond would be if Bond was an actual person.
Right.
But yet you lose that camp factor that makes it so fun and enjoyable to watch in the first place.
Right.
And they can only go so far with it. Like there is still the little callbacks, not as much, the little callbacks to it. To the point where like when Sam Mendes took over with Skyfall, it was like, well, you know, he has a story where he's like, someone would come up to me and be like, okay, you're going to make it fun again, right? And then the next person would be like, oh, you're the right director. You're going to make it nice and serious. And just, it's like, I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
So he tried to do both. But yeah, I mean, with this one, it was just, you know, I am of the camp, just because I am a purist, to say like, you know, Connery is the Bond.
Sure.
And he looks it, he feels it. And throughout this whole movie, watching it again, it's just amazing looking at it. It's like you don't know what you're doing is a thing yet.
Right.
But it just feels
and isn't
like
that
a thing.
crazy to think about? It's like so many of the movies that we talk about on the show, it's like you're doing that thing from Jaws.
Yeah.
But when you're doing it in Jaws, you're just doing the thing.
Right.
And you don't know that it's going to be the thing from Jaws.
Right.
You don't know that the gun barrel is going to be iconic. You don't know that the opening credits animation is going to mean something, and it's going to be somebody's job over the next like 30 years. Oh, what do you do? Oh, I do the opening credits for James Bond films. Right. That's crazy.
That is like, the gun barrel is as iconic as the scroll from Star Wars. It's like, you know, when it starts, it's like, okay, I expect to see that. If I don't see that, then I don't know what I'm watching. I don't know if this is
so much
Bond.
so that when we see Casino Royale, we don't get the gun barrel sequence until after the first fight. And then when you see it, it's like, boom, movie starting. And you're like, okay, this was really cool and I'm on board. And speaking of gun barrel, that's not Sean Connery. In the first 3 films he does, it's his stuntman, Bill Simmons. It's not until Thunderball it's actually Sean Connery.
The Bill Simmons?
Yeah. Bill Simmons is the guy who runs VCAM.
Not Sean Connery's double.
Wow, that'd be interesting, wouldn't it?
Really?
We have our first Bond girl with Honey Rider, played by the gorgeous Ursula Andress, who became a star like that. And she's quoted as saying, I don't really get it. I just walked out of the water in a bikini and suddenly I'm the it girl, which is great, but I was like, what? How is that even a thing?
Every guy said, who's that?
Exactly. And you have Felix Leiter's first appearance, which Jack Lord never played him again because they thought he was too handsome. They thought he needed to be a little schlubbier and be more of a sidekick to Sean Connery's James Bond, so he was recast after that. But you can see where everything is going to go from here. And you can see how... I think these movies work best in the 60s. Because once we get into the 70s and 80s, it gets a little wonky, mostly because the way that Ian Fleming writes it, the bad guy is going to be the Soviets.
Yep.
Because that's who it was when he was writing it. Although he changes it from the Soviets to this fake organization, Spectre or SMERSH, depending on which novel you're reading, because he thought near the end of the 50s that the Cold War was close to over and the Soviets weren't going to be a problem anymore. Joke's on you, buddy. It was another 25 years. But then once the Cold War does end, we have that commentary in the Brosnan bonds of, well, the Cold War's over, we don't need you anymore. But even still in the 80s and stuff, it's like, who's really the bad guy?
Yeah.
You know, and Bond needs to both have a threat that he can manage, but also a threat that's global.
Right.
It's kind of that gray area that the Marvel universe can't quite figure out. It's like, okay, is this a world-destroying problem, a city-destroying problem, or a universe-destroying problem? And they just kind of bounce around between all of them so much that you can't figure out what the stakes are.
Right.
And that happens a little bit within the 24 Bond films. But this one's pretty solid in that we have one guy who's doing a thing that is detrimental to the world economy, to everything. So much so that it was delayed in its release because of the Cuban Missile Crisis in the States. Just because they were like, I don't know, this kind of is a little too true to life.
And I think like that's, you see where the campiness comes in the later ones. But I agree, like those 60s Bonds with Connery, what's great about them is that, yeah, at that time the world is kind of falling apart and is getting a little crazy, and people need that escapism.
Yep.
And I always, you know, when I think about Bond now and what that means to him, I think of, you know, different movie, but Catch Me If You Can. You know, that he goes and he sees Dr. No, and he's like, I want that suit, I want that car. That's what the Bond was about, is like the style of it, and the you
it
just
became
you
a
watch
phenomenon.
It. Right.
It's, I mean, skinny ties, sharp suits, watches, nice shoes, Aston Martins, like everything about Bond has become a style icon. So much so that one of my favorite podcasts right now is the James Bonding podcast. Matt Myra and Matt Gorley do it. And every other episode, they'll talk about a film. And I'm now like 4 behind, just because I got caught up on a D&D podcast of all things. And so on their off episodes, they'll do like the best gadgets, the best henchmen, the best Bond girls, and they'll compile their lists and talk about them for an hour and a half or whatever. And if that's your kind of, if that's your jam, it's so much fun to be like, oh yeah, remember when he had the taser and the phone too? And then you think about the practicality of that. It's like, all right, I can't get my phone to stay charged for a full day, but I'm going to use 20,000 volts to tase somebody?
Yeah.
How do you recharge from that? That's a lot of time in your car.
The other thing that's happening too, as Bond is getting, you know, as they keep going through the 70s and the 80s and then into the 90s, it's like there's a way you can, we talked about this when we talked about North by Northwest, and that like,
which was a huge inspiration for this film.
right, and it's like that started the modern action film, and then Dr. No comes out and James Bond comes out, and like that ushers in the new modern action film.
Yeah.
Then Steven Spielberg and George Lucas are on a beach, and Steven Spielberg says to Lucas, I want to make a James Bond movie, and Lucas says, I have something better. Indiana Jones comes in, and that becomes the new action film.
Yep.
Then someone says, I want to take that archetype and I want to make a blue collar James Bond. That's Die Hard. So then everything becomes Die Hard.
Yeah.
So it's like, you know, the one way you can kind of watch this film in particular, and then as it gets deeper into the Connerys, is like it just ushers in the template for an action film.
Mm-hmm.
The guy against the world.
Yep.
Or the person against the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what I think, like, why we're talking about this on Vermont Film Essentials, why we're, you know, why we wanted to talk about Bond and get into
Mm-hmm.
it, is, you know, there's such a, it's so rare to get a great action movie
Yeah.
that works.
That is that universally works,
Yes.
because there are 8 Fast and Furious movies. 3 of them are good. Good. Not great, good.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them are fine, and a few of them are awful. So in 8 movies, you only got 3 kind of right. So for 24 films to exist with the same central character, based on the same source material, that's insane.
And a new audience finding them.
Yeah.
You know, there's probably kids who love the Daniel Craig ones that look back at the Connery ones and laugh,
Oh, of course.
right?
Just like those of us who grew up with Brosnan look at Roger Moore and we're like, what is this?
That's
That's not great. But once you get into it and you learn about it and you read about it and you find out, you know, the same guy has done the theme for 20 some odd films. The trumpet fanfare,
Yep.
I think that guy just died last year. He played the trumpet in the James Bond theme in like 23 films. That's crazy town. That's a 40-year career playing trumpet.
And that it doesn't even really, it doesn't change. It just gets a little enhanced. It gets better quality.
Yeah.
But that underpinning, that trumpet sound, that theme is just there.
Yeah.
And it's iconic. You can't change it. You can't, like, you know, do anything to it. It's like, oh, I'm going to play it on, you know, a piano, and it's
Yeah.
just going to be different.
But you
It's still the same
look at
theme.
you look at the films, and there's some subtle incorporation of the Bond theme in a different kind of instrument. In the 80s, it got more synthy and more poppy, and
That it becomes, it's a machine that will always work, because it's like, who's the pop star of the
right,
day?
right,
So they're going to do the theme song.
yeah. And then you can have the conversation, the best Bond theme songs,
Right.
and I'm sure there's an episode of James Bonding about that. And there was a long-running theory.
It's Goldfinger.
Goldfinger. There's a long-running theory that may only be Kyle's, but I completely agree with him that if it's a good song, the movie's not going to be as good. But if the song's somewhat forgettable, it's going to be a great film, like Casino Royale, for example, or this. This doesn't even really have a theme song, which that doesn't really kick in until they start branding the film
Right.
with its own theme. But this has the first time we hear the James Bond theme, and then that's all we ever need again. I did appreciate that they keep singing the Under the Mango Tree song throughout.
He sings in this.
He does. He's the only Bond to ever sing. They incorporate that song orchestrally a few times through the movie, and you're like, oh, how about that? It's very well shot. They do miniature work incredibly well in this film. They do rear projection
Yep.
serviceably. It is the 60s after all. But then we have the Dr. No's lair with the giant aquarium with the huge fish. And he goes, oh, it's the glass is convex, so it makes it appear magnified. When, in truth, they forgot that they needed to get footage of fish for the aquarium, so they just got some random footage from a library, and it was enlarged. The print was too big, so they're like, these fish are like 3 feet. What are we gonna do? And they're like, let's just blame it on the glass. Say it's magnified. So that's why the fish are so big. Oops, mistake, but they figured it out. It's just little things like that. They intentionally built furniture in the set slightly smaller so he would look bigger, so he would be more imposing when he would walk into a room. The shot of him holding the pistol, it's a water gun, because they forgot the prop when they went to do the publicity shoots, and the photographer had a water pistol in his car, so like, just do it. And like we talked about on Blazing Saddles, and we've talked about so many times, this really shouldn't have worked. This should have just been a B movie, like straight onto, one of the BBC channels and then forgotten. But it was a huge phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right, it's a little bit sexist. It's a lot of racial insensitivity and stuff that now you look at it and you go, well, that could never happen again.
Right.
But it's a product of the times. And if you can see each movie as like a mini time capsule of what's going on, I think that it's a very good representation of each era that it's in.
And there really is they're just now figuring out that, women feel this way too. But it is, watching a person with confidence go through so much and in the end doing the thing that he's meant to do. That's always going to work.
Yeah.
There's never going to be a time when that doesn't work, unless it's a terrible movie.
Right.
But like that is what, it's not that they're in Jamaica, it's not that they're, it's not that Ursula comes out in the bikini, but that helps.
It helps.
It's not anything except the fact that Connery plays it so well. He's got the charisma. He's so suave, and he's just whatever is put in front of him, he is knocking down and getting through. And that's what made people go to the cinemas to see it, and that's what people caught on to. And then 24 films later, that is still the thing.
Yeah. And you can see it in even modern stuff like Wonder Woman. Yes, she's a god, but she's just confident in what she needs to do. James Bond's the same way. He's like, okay, I gotta go to Jamaica and stop this guy named Dr. No from launching this rocket. And that's what he does. He's able to, he has some missteps along the way and he gets captured and he has to fight a bunch of guys and blow up a bunch of stuff, but he accomplishes his goal. And he gets a girl in the end, which is also, a boy's dream of, I'm going to wear a dope suit and I'm going to save the day and I'm going to get the girl. And that becomes the James Bond trope over the next 40 years. Which is, that's crazy to think about too. I read that Adele's song for Skyfall debuted on the 50th anniversary of Dr. No. That same day, the song debuted.
I was going to say that's when I think about it, it wasn't perfect, but I certainly liked it more than most of them that I've seen lately. That would be a case of like the song being good.
Yeah, that one kind of broke the norm because you got Writing on the Wall for Spectre. Both are kind of lackluster. I don't like that song. When it came out, I was like,
I guess I'm not seeing this movie.
What do we think? Do we like this one? I don't like it so much.
I lost my point. Go ahead with something.
I mentioned earlier that this and several other films feature Spectre or Smersh as the villains. This is the only film to feature Spectre, which is a terrible acronym for Special Execution for Counterintelligence, Terrorism, Revenge, and Extortion.
Say what?
Exactly. Ian Fleming, not a great writer. But this is the only film to feature Spectre, but not Blofeld, who becomes like his nemesis for so long, and then becomes a point of legal contention within the series to the point where they kind of kill him off, and then once Sean Connery leaves, they make the unofficial version that has Blofeld in it just because that guy owned the rights to it. So he's like, well, I'm going to make a movie with Blofeld in it. And I got Sean Connery, so I win. And then you watch the movie and you're like, no, you didn't. That movie sucks. And then we finally, with the film Spectre, that's when I think like the term of his settlement was up, like he lost the rights to it. So then Eon Productions was able to get Blofeld back, and that's why we have Christoph Waltz as Blofeld in Spectre. Because up until then, they couldn't legally use that character because he owned it. And it was this huge legal battle that took years and years, and he was just such a buttface about the whole thing. Kevin McClory, look it up. He sucks.
I remember. So this is just a cute little thing, but I don't know if it's still the case, but they always used to come out on my birthday.
That's fun.
November 17th.
You gotta
So every
get,
November 17th, I would look forward to the new James Bond movie that was coming out for at least 5 years.
yeah. And then they ramp up right before Christmas time. This is the first feature film set in Jamaica.
Crazy.
And Jamaica gained its independence from Great Britain 2 months before this film was released. The character, I mentioned this before we started recording, the character of Coral and Strange Ways are actually characters from the novel Live and Let Die that were repurposed into this film, which I thought was interesting having just finished that novel. I was like, oh, Coral, that's neat.
I wonder, did it come up in your research about, like when they made this movie, did they say if it's successful, we have a lot of books that we can get through? Or did they just
I think
say,
that was always their intention when
Yeah.
they purchased the rights. Because Ian Fleming had kind of been hit or miss with any of his writing at that point, and he had originally written a character that would become James Bond named Jimmy Bond, and there was a CBS like episodic show that featured him in some capacity, but it was Jimmy Bond and he was American, but it was the same character essentially. And then of course we have the spoof Casino Royale with Woody Allen.
Yep.
That I want to say 64, but that's also not considered canonical because it's not an Eon production, which is Albert Broccoli and Saltzman. I can't remember his first name now. Either Walter or Howard. Saltzman though. So there's Casino Royale that's out of canon. There's the non-Eon Sean Connery one that I can never remember. And then we have our other 24, soon to be 25. But of the novels, I think when they got the rights to them, they looked through, and Casino Royale would have been the obvious choice. And that's why they did the parody one, because that's the origin and the introduction of Bond. But this one was an easier and cheaper one to make. The budget of this was only like $1 million, and then they ended up going over budget by like 100,000. But you're taking a big risk buying a book series like that, and the books aren't very long either. So it's not like you're making Lord of the Rings or anything. It's just like, all right, we're buying your ideas and your stories more so than the actual books themselves.
That was smart of them, though, as
Yeah,
producers. To
absolutely.
aim
I mean,
smaller.
that's like Darabont, just like buying all of Stephen King's books and being like, okay, which one do I want to adapt next?
Right. How far, so Never Say Never Again,
Mm-hmm.
I forgot, that's not considered one of the 24.
Right. That's the Kevin McClory produced one. He was a producer on Thunderball, and that is your first appearance of Blofeld.
Yep.
So then they got into some kind of disagreement, and they parted ways, Eon and McClory. So then McClory sued, saying that he owned the creative control of the character of Blofeld. So he was denying them from ever using that character again, which was super crappy, because that's like being, one of the creators of Superman and saying, well, you can't use Lex Luthor ever again. Like, what are you talking about? That's his nemesis.
Right.
We've established that from the beginning. And once Thunderball happens, then he's like, you can't use it anymore, and then they get locked into litigation. Any instance that Blofeld would be there, he can't be named and he can't be shown. So it's always like, the hands petting the cat, but you can't say that's Blofeld and that's him. Mm-hmm. So Never Say Never Again is basically just Thunderball again, which I haven't seen Thunderball because it's super long, and even diehard fans of James Bond consider it one of the worst because it's just super long and super boring and not much happens, and then when it's over you're like, oh, okay.
That's what I remember. It was like, it's like Moonraker, Thunderball.
Yeah.
Down.
But I've heard Moonraker the book is excellent, so
Yeah.
I'm very excited to get to that.
And Never Say Never Again is basically kind of like a remake of Thunderball, but with that character in there.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Because he's like, well, I own Blofeld. I'm going to bring in Sean Connery to play James Bond, and there's nothing you can do about it. And then that was the case for so long until that statute of limitations or legalese that I don't understand came to terms, and then like, all right, well, we're getting Blofeld back, and then we have Spectre with Craig and Christoph Waltz.
Just a little diversion, just to talk about how fantastically Mike Myers spoofed this with Austin Powers.
And I'm glad that we're going to talk about it too, because very much like the James Bond films, Austin Powers became diminishing returns, because by the time you get to Goldmember, what are you even doing? The Spy Who Shagged Me is very funny.
Yeah.
But it's intentionally funny. Like, they crammed it full of jokes, whereas Austin Powers is a really good James Bond spoof.
And I think there was something to be said about when, like, 1997, when Austin Powers came out, like, my friends and I went to see it, but I was like, I don't know what I'm getting into, and I don't know what, and I walked in and it was like the most surprising, like, off-the-wall, hilarious thing I've ever seen.
So funny.
So funny.
Endlessly quotable.
And it was, like, it was funny even if I didn't, I had seen a couple of Bonds, the Connery Bonds, so I knew, like, okay, that's where we're heading.
Yeah.
But now looking at them, it's like, oh my God, like, that he did
Every
that so
little
well.
bit, yeah.
And there was a story when Mike Myers was screening, doing a first screening of Austin Powers, like the producers like, we have to redo this whole thing because nobody gets it. Nobody understands who James Bond is.
Right.
Nobody gets who Sean Connery is. So we're not going to do it. And Mike Myers was like, no, foot down. Like, this is the movie.
Yeah,
this is the movie I want to make. And it does. And even to the point where it's like my mom and dad watching Austin Powers for the first time, that was like, gold for me, because they're laughing at it at a completely different way.
Right, because they're getting all the jokes.
Yes.
You're just getting the surface jokes. And it's really fun to go back and watch both the older Bond films, like the Connery 60s, and then Austin Powers again, because then you see all the little pieces. And watching Dr. No now, like I said, as soon as I see him in those stupid plastic suits, I was like, nah, they did that in Austin Powers.
It's also like with Young Frankenstein, when you go back and you watch the Frankensteins, you're like, oh, you picked so well.
I was just pulling images for boyfriend training, and I have Dr. Frankenstein reference. So I was pulling pictures, and it's all Gene Wilder, and then the other Frankensteins, but it's like the same pictures. And I was like, wow. And I haven't seen that many of the Frankenstein movies, so my knowledge of it is from Young Frankenstein. But when you see right next to each other, you're like, wow, he really did a perfect homage of those movies. And it was the same thing with Austin Powers. He got to the core of why those movies worked, and in doing so, gave us the commentary we needed in the late 90s that you're a dinosaur, you're a misogynistic jerk, nobody needs you around anymore. But then he ends up being a very capable hero. Right. And he's able to learn and to grow. And I think, because that was 2 years after GoldenEye, and I kind of think the creators of James Bond looked at it and were like, okay, this might work. We might be able to pull this off. And then it was just kind of downhill from there, because you have Tomorrow Never Dies, which is okay.
I remember seeing that and liking it.
And then you have World Is Not Enough, which is just, if they had recast Denise Richards plays a nuclear physicist in that movie named Christmas Jones. If you want to watch on...
so they didn't learn anything from Austin Powers.
Clearly not. If you want to watch what that movie would look like without Denise Richards, go to my YouTube channel where I have cut her out of World Is Not Enough. And you know what? It works.
You did that?
I did. I went through and I cut Denise Richards' scenes and put it all back together. And yeah, it kind of looks like he's talking to himself sometimes.
You should try to... You know that Steven Soderbergh, when he was on a hiatus, would do that. Like he's like, just as an experiment, I decided to make shorter cuts of long movies to see how they hold up.
Yeah.
I forget the one that he did that like everyone was like, how could you do that? Yeah, lost it. But he does that. But
and then Topher Grace famously recut the Star Wars prequels into one film. And it doesn't exist anywhere because of copyright. But if there's a friend of Topher Grace out there who could get me a copy of that, that would be really neat. And I kind of want to do it. He just went through and he just crammed it all together, and it starts with young Anakin and it ends with him becoming Vader, and there's your movie. as it should have been George. God. Anyway, fun story about Major Boothroyd, who then becomes Q. Major Boothroyd is the guy who brings him the gun, tells him that the Beretta is unreliable. This is a very serviceable weapon in a woman's handbag. Again, Ian Fleming, kind of a dick. Major Boothroyd is based on a guy named Jeffrey Boothroyd, who wrote to Ian Fleming after either the second or third novel, imploring him to give James Bond a better gun than the Beretta. He's like, this isn't a good gun. I know weapons and all this stuff, to the point where Ian Fleming met with him. They talked about weapons. He's like, this would be a good weapon for him. He showed him different guns, allowed him to shoot him and all this stuff. And he named the character after him. And then that character then becomes Q, who is his quartermaster. And I just thought that that was really cool. Because in Casino Royale, he has a Colt something or other. And you're like, that, what? Like a frontiersman gun? That's crazy. And then in Live and Let Die, he has a Beretta, like almost instantly, because of this guy Boothroyd.
Thanks,
So
Boothroyd.
there's a lesson there for writers. Pay attention to your fans, because they might know more than you.
Is there any other I was just thinking about this. Is there any other franchise where the titles are different, and there's no, like, it's not like James Bond, Dr. No?
Yeah. I don't know. That's a good question.
Because that's another crazy thing is, like, you know, a new Bond film shows up, and just by, you know, whatever the marketing is, we know it's the next James Bond movie.
Sure.
And again, it's that music. Two, it's the
gun barrel.
You just have to see the gun barrel, and you're like, oh, I know what this is.
And you can see it on mute, and you'd be like, oh, James Bond movie.
Yep.
Connery is afraid of spiders.
So he did not like that scene.
He didn't like that scene.
Oh, glass.
Yeah.
Again.
You can see it. If you're looking for it, you can see it. Mostly because as the spider gets like right here,
Yep.
it just points at him for a while. It's because it's on a plate of glass.
So that's 3 movies now.
Yeah. And on any of the close-ups, that's his stuntman. And then you may notice that when it gets like up here, it's just kind of hovering because it's on glass. And the tarantula's name was Rosie. I didn't even make this connection, but we were at the Butterfly Pavilion in Boulder, Colorado, and we're walking through, and there's someone just sitting there holding a tarantula, and they're like, would you like to hold a tarantula? And Rachel's like, yes, and I'm like, I don't. So she goes over, and you just put your hands out like this, and they just put the tarantula right in there.
I would have screamed, ran away.
I did it.
You held the tarantula?
I held the tarantula. Guess what her name was?
Rosie?
It was Rosie. Isn't that crazy?
They knew.
They're like, we should name this after Dr. No's tarantula. Connery wore 2 hairpieces in this film. He had started going bald at the age of 21.
I didn't know that.
He has a dry one and a wet one. And as you get...
Bring me the wet one.
As you can get into You Only Live Twice and the later ones that he's in, it's really thin up in here, and it's getting very wispy and comb-overy. And for the longest time, there was debate. Is he wearing a hairpiece? Yes, he's wearing a hairpiece. Finish those. So this movie has some funny international title translations. In Japan, it was called "We Don't Want Doctors." Dr. No, we don't want. Okay.
Fine, Japan.
But exclamation point. We don't want doctors. In South Korea, it was called 007 Murder Number. It's a little on the nose, guys. The character of Sylvia Trench, our first femme fatale in the red dress, she was originally supposed to be completely nude when revealed in his hotel room, golfing into his hat. But of course, they were like, we're never going to get that by the censors. That reveal of James Bond, he doesn't appear in this film until the 8-minute mark. But that reveal, I wish I'd written it down, but it's based on an old 30s film where you see this series of cuts of close-ups of their hands, of their suit, and then reaction shots of people around them before we finally see their face. And Kyle talks about it in his clip that he sent us, you just know that it's, okay, this guy is cool as hell right now. The way that he lights the cigarette and the way that he's just like, hey, what's up? I'm playing Baccarat, which I don't know how to play. That game makes no sense to me. And he's got the cigarette and he's in the tux and it's the coolest.
See, even that, and then I immediately think of, I'll stay. I suggest you hit, sir. I also like to live dangerously. But yeah, it's kind of like Bogart and Casablanca. It's like you give them the, give them the great reveal, and it's like that. There's our hero. We're following you.
And he's wearing the white tux, and then Bond wears the white tux. I mean, they're essentially the same character.
Right.
He's just American. Our villain doesn't appear in this movie until 87 minutes into it. We hear his voice when he talks to Professor Dent.
Yep.
But we don't see him until 88 minutes, which is crazy.
That is, like, I thought it was crazy because it's a little bit shorter in Skyfall, where we finally see Javier Bardem. And I remember looking at the clock and being like, wow, come on, like, is there a villain somewhere?
Yeah. This was the shortest James Bond film until Quantum of Solace.
Yep.
And the only reason that one is shorter is because that was being made during the writer's strike. So all the writers had to go away, and Craig and Martin Campbell had to kind of finish the script. So that one's very action heavy because they're just like, well, let's just do another action set piece to move the story along. The pillow in the bed trick that he does to trick Dent was actually in the novel of The Spy Who Loved Me. So they're kind of cherry picking the things that they want to do out of this. And the last thing that I want to mention from Dr. No is one of my favorite lines. And it's such a cool line. He's sitting there, Dent has just come in, and he's shot up the bed, and he flicks on the light, and they have their moment together, and then he goes to grab the gun again, and he goes, that's a Smith & Wesson, and you've had your 6. Pew, pew, and he kills him. It's cool. It's a cool line. And originally, he shot him 5 times. But they took out the other 3 because it's a bit overkill.
This is where all the cynical quips and the one-liners came in.
And then we get into the Brosnan era of just like, okay, calm down. Too much.
Lincoln, this was fun. Thank you for picking this.
Thank you for picking it too. This is great. And then sometime we'll have to do, in some iteration, in some conversation, we'll do Die Another Day, which is the worst James Bond ever. That's the Halle Berry one. That's the last Brosnan one. Yeah. The 20th, his final, and it's just garbage. It is bad. I mean, I need to watch Thunderball and I need to watch Moonraker so that I've seen the entire canon. But it's just awful.
You're ranking them. Watching them and you're ranking them.
And that's why I've been following along with the James Bonding podcast, because they're going through in random order. Each time that they do a film, the other one will pick one. And I'm now 4 movies behind. But
so what's one for you now?
One for me now, I believe, is still Casino Royale. But let's look at my Letterboxd, because that's the thing. And if you're not following us on Letterboxd, you should. It's a lot of fun, especially if you're a nerd like us. So let's go to my James Bond list. My number 1 is actually GoldenEye. Number 2, Goldfinger. Number 3, Skyfall. And Tomorrow Never Dies is number 4.
Wow. And your 3 and my 3 are the same.
This is only because these are the films that they've watched so far.
Yeah.
So I've watched 11 of the films that they've done, and like I said, I'm many behind at this point. But I was really surprised. Spectre's down at number 9 of my 11 so far.
Well, I heard it wasn't.
It's not great. I revisited it. And they tried to introduce a little bit of the camp and a little bit of the fun. Like there's the moment where he's running across the buildings at the beginning of the film, and he falls through the roof, but he just lands perfectly on a couch. And that would have worked superbly in a Roger Moore Bond. But it doesn't work in a Craig Bond.
It felt like with Mendes in Skyfall, it was like, like he was trying to kind of do both things. Like it felt like he went back and he was like, okay, I'll watch Dr. No, I'll watch Goldfinger, I'll watch the ones that I remember and that I love, and he tried to like, you know, take what's great about them, because there's a point in Skyfall where it's like, okay, we get the kind of the over the top but really fun villain.
Yeah.
We get the car. That was pretty cool. You know, Moneypenny is introduced for the first time. You know, we get all of these iconic things that come in, and that you're like, oh. And then I think, isn't it the first, does M return? M is in Casino Royale and
No, she is. Judi Dench is M from beginning of Brosnan until Spectre.
She dies in Skyfall and it becomes...
Spoiler.
Sorry. if you haven't seen it, come on, what are you doing? But yeah, okay, all right.
Yeah.
Home Alone ending, it's all coming back. This is fun.
Dr. No, man. It's a great... If you like James Bond and you haven't seen Dr. No, go back to the beginning. See the first time the character walks through that padded leather door into M's office and gets his mission briefing, because it's fun. And then let's talk about him, because I love talking about James Bond. I got in an argument with one of the cooks at my restaurant because he's like, James Bond is a superhero. And I said, no, he's not. He is a man. And I got pretty heated about it. And then he's like, well, what do you mean? And I like yelled at him, and I was like, sorry, I didn't realize I was so into this.
He's a man, baby.
It's the same thing.
There's an argument for both.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's kind of a superhero too.
Yeah. He's like, well, Batman isn't a superhero. It's like, he's a vigilante. It's different. Not the point. What's next week?
James Bond doesn't wear a mask.
That's
there
right.
you go. Next week is Midnight Cowboy. So we're going to get all up in that movie.
I know that scene. Not seen the rest of the movie.
We will talk about that scene.
Yeah.
It's going to be great.
Yeah.
And then once again, Tuesday, February 27th, we are going to be at Main Street Landing. We're going to be hosting the free Tuesday nights at the movies, and we're going to be showing The Manchurian Candidate. We're going to be introducing it, and then after the movie, we're going to sit down and talk about a couple things.
Yeah.
But even before we do that, on that day that we usually record, we're going to be recording the episode on The Manchurian Candidate with special guest Nathan Hartswick, who is I saw him yesterday, and he's very excited to sit down with us.
Good deal. Cool. Go watch a James Bond movie, why don't you?
Yes.
Thank you, David.
Have your pick.
Yeah. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ian Fleming, for creating the character, even though you're kind of a turd. Until next week, I'm Lincoln L. Hayes. Bye.